Hello. So I've been making a lot of 3D models lately, and I've also been uploading time-lapse of my attempts to YouTube. Now, these videos were mainly for me as a way to reflect on my workflow and to see what worked and what didn't. But while watching the videos, I've noticed a bit of a problem. The goddamn length. Now, in hindsight, maybe 4-hour-long videos weren't the most efficient way to reflect on an experience. But, you live, you learn. So now, before I post a time-lapse, I'll be posting a time-lapse highlight video where I'll just add a bit of commentary explaining what I was thinking, what worked, what didn't, yada yada, and hopefully it'll be like 10 to 15 minutes long at the most. So that's what this video is going to be. So let's begin. Now, the first thing I needed to do was create a base for the character. Now, the human body is quite a complex piece of geometry, which takes a lot of time, effort, and skill to create. So anyway, I went to Sketchfab, found a body that sort of looked like what I wanted, downloaded it, imported it to Blender, and we got our base. First step done. So now that I had my base, I needed to fix the pose and proportions. To do this, I just gave the model a skeleton so I could more easily deform it. After that was done, I made sure the character's scale was about human size, and then guillotined it down the middle so I could apply a mirror modifier. And then as a final step, I did some retopology and gave the object a new skeleton. So with all that, the base was now done. For now, I was going to have to make adjustments later on, but as it stands, it's in a pretty good place. So it was time to move on to working on other things. So the next thing to work on was the top garments. So I created a t-shirt by just subdividing a plane and then just using the snapping tool to project its vertices onto the base mesh. After that, I added a subsurf modifier to the plane to increase its resolution and to smooth it out. I then also added a shrink wrap modifier just to wrap the plane more tightly around the base mesh. Now, during this part, I ran into a problem that you tend to run into when you convert a 2D image into a 3D character, and that's inconsistencies between views. Now, in this instance, the problem was in the front view, the shirt covered less of the breast and curved upwards. But in the side view, it covered a lot more of the breast and sort of flowed downwards. This created a situation where I needed to pick which style I was going to go with. Initially, I decided to go with the side view since I thought it would be more consistent, but fortunately, as the project continued, I eventually came to my senses and switched to the option that showed more boob. So after working on the shirt for a bit, I decided to move to the necklace. To make the necklace, I created a circle and then applied an array and curve modifier to it. I used a curve modifier here since it meant I could easily deform the necklace without needing to overcommit to the shape, since I knew that I was going to have to adjust it eventually. So after I got the shape that I was somewhat happy with, I added some thickness and subdivision to it, repeated the process for the other parts of the outfit, added a little smiley face and some chains, and then just fixed up a couple more things. And with all that done, the model was ready for some clop simulation. Now, the clop simulation program I'm using is called Marvelous Designer, and this is the reason I scaled the character to real-world units, since having an incorrect scale would screw up the simulation. Now, Marvelous Designer is really good at realistic clop simulation, and luckily for me, while this character is stylized, it's still fairly realistic compared to, other anime designs. So my aim with the simulation wasn't to perfectly replicate the reference image. It was just to have it broadly resemble it so I could do the final touches in Blender. After randomly changing the simulation settings and garments, I eventually reached a good enough point where I was able to move on. I then imported it into Blender where I proceeded to fix up the mesh a bit, stretching things out, straightening things up, cleaning up some of the edges, and then finally adding some creases and puffing up some areas. And with that, the body was ready for the next stage. It was time to create the head. So when creating the head, I initially tried a more common technique of tracing out the eye, jaw, and nose separately and then filling it in. But that was too hard. I don't know why, but I couldn't really wrap my head around it. So instead, I went with a technique more similar to box modeling, where you create broader planes and then you subdivide into them, and I found that to be a lot easier. Another thing I did a little differently from what I've seen other people do is how I framed the face over the reference image. So let me demonstrate what I mean. So here's an actual head in orthographic view, and you can see when we switch to perspective view, the sides of the head become obscured. And this is because when you switch to perspective view, the field of view becomes narrower, so you can't actually see the side of the head when you're looking straight on. So in order to avoid this, I recently started making the face match the width of the reference image, and then having the side of the head extend beyond. So I kept modeling the head, fleshing out a bit, adding stuff like mouth, eyes, eyelashes, just continuing to use the sort of basic box modeling and projecting when I needed it. Nothing we haven't already seen already. And throughout this process, I decided to add an outline and emission shader to the head, just so I could remove unnecessary details and get a previs of what the model's silhouette would look like. I didn't really like how the eyes were looking, but I thought maybe it would look better after I added the hair, so I decided to ignore it for the time being. So to do the hair, I basically just did what everyone else does, where you use some curves and a bevel modifier, and then just, extrude that out a bit. If you want more information, I'll put a link to a video that demonstrates that in the description. So after I gave the character some hair and accessories, I had another look, and the eyes do look like shit. So I decided not to try anything fancy and to just copy the main reference. After fixing up the eyes, adding a few more accessories, it was time to add the head to the main project. Now, the reason I didn't immediately start working on the hair was because I knew I needed the body to compare it with, or else I would have just completely messed up the scale and just had to redo it anyway. So I decided to save that part for later. So with all the main elements in the scene, I decided to start posing the character and adding some color to it. After I finished that, I took a look at the character and tried to identify any obvious problems. After looking at it for a bit, I really didn't like how the hips were looking, so I decided to try widen them. And I also had to fix up the shoulder area, since after I posed the arms, they got a little bit warped. After making those changes, I started working on the hair. Now, the hair was one of the more challenging parts of the project, since it's a very unique style, and it made it very hard to understand what the hell was going on. Normally when modeling the hair, I go to Sketchfab and try to see how others approach, certain hairstyles, but with this character's unconventional design, that wasn't really an option. So I just had to try my best, and admittedly, it didn't turn out great, but oh well, what can you do? So after finishing the hair, it was time to add some more detail to the character, in the form of hard shadows. So I created a body texture and started painting on it. As I was doing that, I realized I still didn't really like how the hips were looking. So after messing around with it for a bit, I found that lifting the leg bones made it look a lot better. So after fixing up the items around the hips for the millionth time, I felt happy enough with the character's pose and its shape to start adding more detail to the body and pants. So I scoped some wrinkles onto the pants, I added the beads to the hands, and I just added extra line art to, everything else. So with the geometry finished, it was time to start texturing for real. Now, in the past, I've only ever really painted with flat color. I've done some procedural stuff with gradients, but I've never tried painting gradients before. So what I'm trying to say is when I started texturing, I had no idea what the hell I was doing. So my first idea was to paint really dark and then use the blur tool to get a nice transition between the base color and the shadow color. That did not work. So then I thought, okay, maybe those colors were a little too far apart. Maybe if I add a mid-tone, then I'll be able to get the effect I wanted. That also did not work. Now, to be fair, using the mid-tone did sort of work. The color was blending, but for some reason, the blur tool was causing Blender to freeze quite a bit. I'm assuming it's because the texture was too large, but at the time, I really didn't want to decrease the texture size, so I just decided to try something else. I eventually decided trying to transition between such extreme values was going to be way too hard. So I ended up repainting the body with a mid-tone instead. I then tried overlaying two colors and then color picking the middle value. And, this actually worked pretty well. But trying to figure out the right opacity to use and also getting comfortable with the technique took me a bit of time. Eventually, I did get used to it and I started making good progress. So I started painting the body, face, hair, top, pants, and honestly, I was pleasantly surprised with how it was turning out. I mean, it definitely wasn't great, but the result didn't make me just want to completely give up. Okay, so after painting the body, the next thing was to paint the head. Now, the head was actually fairly easy to paint compared to the other parts of the character, because, it's a fairly basic shape compared to all the other things. The main problem was the lips, since, I have this massive gap in the surface. So it created a lot of issues when trying to paint it. And eventually to deal with that, I sort of figured I'd just ignore it and then fix it towards the end. The other thing that I had some troubles with was the nose, because in the reference image, it shows the light on like the left side of the nose bridge, which sort of confused me. And I thought it should be on like the right side of it. So I figured I'd just ignore it and just do what I thought was more physically accurate. It didn't honestly look that great, so maybe I still did it wrong, but oh well, it wasn't a big deal. So after painting the face, it was time to paint the hair. Now, painting the hair was definitely the hardest part. I still was struggling to understand what the hair was actually doing. You know, I just tried my best by doing some cliche stuff that you do where you paint the dark colors underneath the hair. I tried adding some gradients that matched the concept art, and I just tried to match the reference as best as I could. And after all that work, this is the result. And so now that I'm done recapping, what's the major takeaway from this project? Well, let's start with the good. Overall, I think the project turned out pretty good. I was pretty worried that the subpar shading would completely ruin it, but honestly, it's not like the model itself was all that. So in hindsight, it was a pretty silly worry. But this does make me want to reevaluate my use of character bases, since a major issue I had with this project was trying to get the hips to look good. There were multiple times where I had to redo the hips, which forced me to redo everything around it, which took so much bloody time. Now, you could say that I should wait more before adding detail, but I think the real main issue here was me not wanting to deviate too much from the base's original shape. While I definitely don't regret using bases, I think it's gotten to the point where it's more of a hindrance than a benefit. I think this project shows that even if I don't do a good job making my own base, it's not like it's going to completely ruin the project. So I guess if I want to improve in any meaningful way now, I'm going to have to do the boring task of learning anatomy. Well, on the bright side, at least that means the next character I model is going to be wearing a bikini. So, silver lining. This video was sort of an experiment, so I don't know if I'll make another one like it, but I hope you liked it anyway. Till next time.